Welcome to this webinar. We are talking about women's health today. We will obviously go through general strategies and lessons that we both learned around executing trials in women's health. Valentina's spotlight will be on you and Day and your guys' awesome product, and also the trial that we ran together for Day's STI screening tampon. I'll just start with a quick intro on myself and Linda's Health and then turn it over to you, Valentina. But my name is Mary, one of the co-founders here at Linda's Health. After having several frustrating experiences on the sponsor side when it came to research and also becoming a patient in several clinical trials, I felt that the whole model for how we do outsourced clinical research was very broken and needed a rethink. So at Linda's Health, we run radically faster, more reliable end-to-end clinical trials in a variety of areas, but women's health is rightfully a big area of focus for us. And yeah, look forward to having a great discussion today on this topic. With that, Valentina, I'll hand over to you for more of an in-depth intro.
Thank you, Mary. I'm Valentina. I'm a gynecological health researcher with a special interest in period and pelvic pain and vaginal health. I started Day really inspired by my own personal experiences in gynecological health, which opened my eyes to the very deep and extreme gender health gap. Currently, the status quo is that medical innovation simply ignores, neglects, or outright misunderstands the needs of female patients. And if you're wondering why that is the case, it's because women were not allowed to take part in clinical research up until 1993 in the United States and 1995 in the UK and Europe. So as a result, we know very little about how the medications and medical devices that we have on the market today affect the female physiology versus the male physiology. And this gender bias is very interesting because it starts even before we can commence human clinical trials. Researchers tend to prefer male mice and male rabbits over female mice and female rabbits because they're worried about how the menstrual cycle might pollute the quality of their clinical data. And this is actually the term that's being used, which I think is very telling. And another area in which the gender gap is very prominent is in the diagnosis of different diseases. So this is a study from 2019 from the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. And keep in mind that Denmark has achieved some of the highest levels of gender parity in the delivery of healthcare. Yet still in Denmark, a comparative study with 70,000 patients demonstrated that women get diagnosed later than men across 700 different diseases. So for cancer, women get diagnosed 3.5 years later than men. And for diabetes, women get diagnosed 4.5 years later than men. So this is a really long time in which we're having the patient not get access to the care that they need, but also we're allowing the disease to progress and potentially worsen. And then narrowing this down even further to the space of gynecological health screening and gynecological diagnoses, the situation is even worse. So what is on the screen is the speculum, which for those of you who have not had a pelvic exam or not had a speculum exam might seem like an ancient torture device. And it is actually ancient. So the first speculum that was invented dates back to the times of the Roman Empire. And unfortunately, the design has largely remained unchanged, even though this is a tool that's used in the majority of gynecological health appointments today. So it keeps the vagina open. It enables the practitioner to see the cervix. And about 70% of patients bleed after a speculum exam. So it's very painful, very uncomfortable. And that's why most women and AFAB individuals tend to ignore their STI check, they ignore their pap smear because they just find it too invasive and too time consuming. So it was these personal experiences that I had having my first menstrual cycle very young. I was 9, which at that time was considered very young, but now it's actually the average age that girls are starting to menstruate, that really opened my eyes to a bigger societal issue, which is that we invest very little into conditions that are female specific and very little into ensuring that clinical trials are representative of the actual populations that will be using the medications. And that's why I wanted to start a company. I wanted to try and make a dent in the gender health gap, in this impenetrable ceiling, it seems. And beyond the introduction of our first product, which was a pain-relieving tampon for localized menstrual pain relief, we next introduced, with the help of Linda's, a diagnostic tampon for at-home STI, vaginal infection, and importantly, HPV screening for cervical cancer detection. So in this medical device, we took a very different approach. Instead of trying to repurpose something that was designed for male health and then make it work for women's health, we started from ground zero. We created a tampon that is specifically designed for the vagina So the swab, which is what we typically use in STI and HPV screening, was never designed for the vagina. It was designed for your nose and your throat, and then repurposed for women's health. I call this hand-me-down innovation. Instead of taking this conventional approach, we use a tampon, which covers the entirety of the vaginal canal. It comes with an applicator that enables the patient to reach the cervix by themselves without the need for a speculum. And what happened when we placed women at the center of innovation is that we created something that works much better for women. So with the help of Lindus, we were able to complete a clinical trial much, much faster than we were able to do so before when we were working with conventional CROs, when we were working purely with academia. We were able to recruit all of the participants that we needed for our quite complex clinical trial in about 2 weeks. And what we've been able to do on the back of working with Lindus Health, so they is a venture capital backed organization. And even though we're in the world of complex medical devices and complex diagnostic devices, we do have to move quite fast. So being able to complete our clinical trial so quickly meant that we could then start adding patient value and adding provider value very quickly as well. So I'm very pleased to share with you that the Day Diagnostic Tampon is now named as a Time Best Invention of 2024. And it's currently being utilized by the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, as well as by multiple obstetricians in the United States. We often assume that medical devices need to be made out of plastic or that they should just be unsustainable. With the help of Lindus, we were able to commercialize a more sustainable diagnostic solution as well. So what you see on the screen is footage from our water-soluble tampon applicator. So this is what helps the patient reach their cervix, and our water-soluble tampon wrapper, which still ensures sterility, but it doesn't leave petrol-derived microplastics behind. I don't think medical innovation should cost the earth, and we've been able to demonstrate that it's possible to think about sustainability as well. I'll hand it over to Mary now, who will share more about what we can do to help bridge the gender care gap.
Thanks so much, Valentina. And yeah, I think you teed it up perfectly, right? Because it's very clear in hindsight that these disparities we see in outcomes in women's health feed through from the lack of female participants in clinical trials, barriers to female participants. And we're very aware that we as a research organization have a huge responsibility to make sure that both women's health studies are being conducted effectively, as well as all studies are as accessible as possible to female participants. So yeah, we're going to spend the next kind of portion diving into kind of more practical examples of how together Lindus and Day have been able to implement strategies to make all trials, particularly women's health trials, run faster and more effectively. But yeah, Valentina, I'll hand over to you just to talk about some of these sex-specific concerns.
So it's very important to not follow in the existing pathway of just trying to pretend that women are smaller men. That's what we've assumed to date, that women are just not physiologically different, but just a smaller kg version of men. We do need to actively account for hormonal variations. Cardiovascular health is very important. One of the areas that we need to be aware of is that in the UK, we have a serious issue with diagnosing heart attacks. We know to recognize the symptoms of a heart attack that show up in the male physiology. So this is what you may have seen in movies with someone holding their heart, having weakness in their left hand. The female heart attack shows up very differently, and data from the British Heart Association shows that 52% of female patients that show up in an emergency room with an active heart attack get turned away because doctors are only trained to recognize the heart attack symptoms in men, but not in women. Bone density is another thing that we need to be aware of, particularly in perimenopausal and menopausal patients. I always find it completely shocking when I think about the fact that medical doctors spend about a day of their entire medical training learning about perimenopause and menopause, despite the fact that this condition will affect the majority of their patients for 15 to 20 years of their life. And we also know that with autoimmune responses, so women are the predominant sufferers of autoimmune diseases. We know that anywhere between 70 to 80% of autoimmune patients are female, and having an autoimmune disease is likely to change the way in which you're going to absorb medications, change which medications are going to be effective for you. So we need to adequately control for sex-specific differences within clinical trials, which can be hard to do in a conventional clinical trial model with conventional clinical trial patient recruitment as well. So we know that most clinical trials performed by academia focus on recruiting young, white, university student males. This is not representative of the majority of the populations, which might be using those medications later on.
So yeah, thinking about how we can, from the trial design stage, implement better designs that are more friendly for female participants, we think a lot about endpoint selection at Lindus Health. Now, obviously, like with every trial, particularly a registrational or pivotal trial, you're slightly limited by the gold standard, the air quotes, endpoints that you need to select. But the reality is that we've never had so much creative freedom to propose secondary or exploratory endpoints, as well as, frankly, particularly the FDA are becoming more and more accepting of, let's say, more modern endpoints in studies. And it's really incumbent on us to select endpoints and outcomes that are important to women that kind of correlate with the felt outcomes or experiences of a condition. And we can talk about what those are, but obviously very specific to the condition itself. Patient centricity, this is a really big one. What we always try and do is incorporate feedback from a diverse set of participants, obviously, particularly women, for women's health studies, to understand how the proposed study design will fit into the everyday lives of participants, and going so far as to impact on things like endpoint selection, on eligibility criteria. And even if we can't take everyone's feedback into account for proposed design, it's always really interesting for guiding kind of the direction of future research. Finally, on logistics, I found that kind of the study of logistics and how you operationalize a trial can have a surprisingly big impact on the patient experience. What we've seen have a huge impact is things like, for studies, we've done a few women's health studies that involve daily ePro questionnaires or diaries, and we've seen a huge boost in adherence and retention just by, in every time we enroll a subject, taking the time to understand their daily activities, their daily schedule, and customizing, for instance, when they receive a questionnaire. We recently completed a study in vasomotor symptoms that required twice daily questionnaires. We were able to achieve compliance of above 97% for that, for twice daily questionnaires for over 3 months. And that was thanks to just really understanding each participant as an individual, making them aware that they'd be receiving these questionnaires, that it was important that they fill them out in a timely manner, and then working with them to define a schedule that worked. Some participants said, look, I have childcare duties at these times, so this time is better. It's a small change, but it has a really big impact. Another real example we've seen is we do studies in, for instance, a postpartum population. There was one study recently where the sponsor was initially averse to offering compensation for childcare, but just something as simple as offering compensation for childcare while the participant might have to be at the site can make a massive difference and is just the right thing to do ethically by participants. So some of these like small operational tweaks can have a huge impact to enrollment timelines and adherence and ultimately on the success of a study.
This is such an important point. Childcare and work appointments are one of the key reasons for why women are not taking part in clinical trials at the same rate as men. So something as simple as tweaking the design of the clinical trial or tweaking the design of the incentive structure can make a world of difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And on reproductive health and pregnancy, obviously, Valentina, as you highlighted, one of the original excuses, let's say, for not including female participants in clinical research are these concerns around health and pregnancy. These are reasonable, and no one's denying that. But if you're not enrolling, if you're not enrolling female subjects, you're just passing the buck and potentially endangering the general population, women in particular, who might, where the treatment might not have been adequately tested in that population. So it's important we get this right. Offering contraception is a requirement to join most, I would say, kind of drug or IMP clinical trials. Obviously, that should be offered at no cost to the participant. And education around these contraceptive methods is the least we can do to do right by participants. And then also making sure that there are longer-term follow-ups and there is adequate medical monitoring, medical guidance available for participants with childbearing potential should they encounter any issues with contraceptives or any concerns around potential impacts on a pregnancy. All super important aspects that, frankly, a CRO should absolutely be taking care of as a top priority.
Yeah, so some of the psychosocial considerations to keep in mind when recruiting female participants, as Mary said, we can't just assume that every female participant will be careless with their fertility and that they wouldn't take contraception or that they could become pregnant at any point. This is actually one of the key reasons for why female patients tend to have less trust in medical providers, less trust in the pharma industry because of the assumption that we're not responsible enough to look after ourselves or to maintain the rules of the trial really need to be taken into consideration. Most women's health conditions, given that they are so severely underdiagnosed or that there's a really low standard of care, whether we're talking about menopause, endometriosis, polycystic ovarian syndrome, or primary dysmenorrhea, quote unquote, simple period pain, the mechanism of action for which we only recently discovered in the 21st century, knowing that your patient that's participating in your clinical trial might be coming to your clinical trial with, first of all, really high levels of hope if they're already in a position where they've tried everything that's on the market, they've spoken to multiple different healthcare providers, and they haven't received answers. So managing that hope is a really essential part of ensuring that you have a successful clinical trial, but also ensuring that your patient is really well supported with educational resources, which working with a digital first CRO like Lindus makes the creation of all of your information materials and your marketing materials really important. One of the interesting dichotomies that we see a day, because we have a direct to patient brand and our consumer branding is, for the lack of a better word, quite beautiful. There's illustrations, bright colors. We spend a lot of time thinking about the logo and the visuals that we use. And typically when we're pitching to the NHS or we're having conversations with providers or pharma companies, there's a really heavy discount that's placed on us as a company because of us having this visual expression. But it ends up being a key way in which we get the patient to not only open up and be open to the innovation that we're providing, but also be really strict with following the rules of the clinical trial and following the prescription of the medication or the intervention that we're recommending. So, for example, with the diagnostic tampon trial, we were able to offer video instructions, written instructions, illustrated instructions to really meet the patient where she is and to ensure that all of our medical innovation was taking into account the different psychosocial considerations that should be kept in mind when designing clinical trials for the female population.
Yeah, it's so funny you say that about the kind of discount for having a kind of consumer branded product, which just ultimately makes no sense because both your trial participants and your end customers are consumers. And so they very reasonably infer the quality of the product or intervention based on the kind of brand and how they experience the product. And actually, I've been like delighted to see Days ads all over virtually every US city I visited in the last few months. And I know we've been getting kind of photos from our team. I think I've seen them in Atlanta, in New York, and our team has seen them further afield as well. So really cool.
It's funny you should mention that because the results from HP Validate came out recently, which was the NHS's really large study into self-sampling for HPV. And the data showed that there was a 13% increase in taking part in self-sampling programs, which was not the rate that the NHS or the clinicians who were part of that study were expecting. And when you look at the design of the kit that was sent to the patient, it's a see-through pouch with the swab visible. The instructions that were used were incredibly heavy in medical language, so not language that meets the patient where they are. If we were to design novel healthcare solutions, novel pharma solutions, novel diagnostic solutions that would present this beautiful outer shell, we're a lot more likely to engage the patient and ensure that they're following the rules of the trial and that they want to opt in the first place, which for female-specific trials is so important because we know we're not effectively reaching women. We know we're not adequately putting the infrastructure in place to connect with female patients taking part in clinical trials.
Yeah, I completely agree. And actually, yeah, that's a good segue into just wanted to touch on some of the lessons we've learned in how to recruit adequately diverse populations in women's health and generally. The way we approach each sort of patient recruitment plan is essentially working backwards from what does the patient population look like in this condition, and then soft stratifying to ensure we end up with a reasonably broad segment of age, ethnicity, and so on. And of course, with the FDA's new guidance around clinical trial diversity, this only becomes more important. But I think like the key innovation here is having a recruitment effort, and we partnered on this on the STAMP study effectively, that can iterate very quickly. You're getting constant feedback about what the current enrolled population looks like, and you can iterate in essentially real time and update the patient recruitment effort to ensure that the final sample you end up with is broad and representative. So just having that loop is really important. This is obviously a lot easier if you're able to run a study with central recruitment. So where you have a central recruitment effort supplementing the enrollment from sites. Obviously, some studies that are in a heavily kind of inpatient population or that just don't lend themselves to this approach, it's still worth getting that kind of feedback loop going with sites so that you can guide them to make sure that you do end up with a representative sample. So I think I covered the digital outreach part, just making sure we have that really tight feedback loop with sort of patient-facing marketing. And like Valentina, as you've illustrated, making sure that just because this is healthcare and clinical trials doesn't mean that we shouldn't be putting, I mean, if anything, we should be putting more effort into the kind of presentation and branding of these efforts, because frankly, a clinical trial participant is worth so much money, usually more money than a kind of a standard customer for a direct-to-consumer purchase. And yeah, I mentioned on healthcare collaborations, that tight feedback loop with sites. What we're also able to do is screen EHR data and identify patients from the community, often from primary care or facilities that wouldn't normally take part as clinical trial sites, and then reach out to those patients and have them referred into a formal clinical trial site. So this is really cool because you can essentially pre-screen participants for eligibility, but you can still see those participants at a normal clinical trial site. So you don't have the overhead of having to set up additional sites in order to access a broader pool of patients or participants. And then finally, on community networks, we've collaborated really effectively with a number of particularly women's health groups around topics like pregnancy, fertility, and a number of other conditions, just to make their kind of membership of their organizations aware of clinical trial opportunities. And these groups are also fantastic groups to go to for feedback around the trial design, ensuring that the voice of the patient is incorporated at the design stage. We're going to transition now into a bit more of an in-depth look at the STAM trial we ran together.
Just on the point of community networks, something that we found really helpful with the STAM trial, also for receiving ethics, was ensuring that we include relevant patient organizations from the very beginning. So we worked with Joe Cervical Cancer Trust, with Wellbeing of Women, which are independent NGOs, to help inform the design of our clinical trial and to then promote the clinical trial that was running. So it's always a great idea to reach out to the patient representation organizations that are relevant to the specific condition that you're focused on. And then going forward into the specific study which we ran with Lindus, the STAMP trial, which was looking at the efficacy of the diagnostic tampon for at-home STI, bacterial vaginosis, and HPV screening. With this trial, we're actually building on top of research that originally dates back to the 1980s. So the first trial on STI testing with tampons was in South Africa. It was actually led by the former Commissioner General of the FDA, Scott Gottlieb. It was then replicated by the University of Westminster, replicated by a few other academic institutions, and just shelved and sat in peer-reviewed journals. And it wasn't brought to market or brought to the patient. So first we designed the intervention, we designed the diagnostic tampon and the applicator, and then we started working with Lindus on the trial design, ethics approval, looping in the relevant academic institutions which we needed for the study, and eventually going into patient recruitment data analyses. So very happy to have collaborated with Dr. Kate Cuscieri, one of the definitive thought leaders within HPV and cervical cancer from the Scottish HPV Reference Laboratory. This really helped inform the design of our trial, the design of the tampon as well, the design of the intervention. And what we aimed to measure was the performance of the diagnostic tampon against the self-collected swab and the clinician-collected swab. What we were able to do with the study was generate the data which we needed for our MHRA submission, for our FDA submission, for our CE marking. And the sample size for the study was 250 patients. So those are the patients that successfully completed the trial. And we started with ethics. We recruited 350 participants. The number of patients that we needed for statistical significance was 250, so we stopped there. I do want to emphasize how working with marketing and digital marketing frameworks and tools really helped us speed up the time to finding the patients that we needed. And I know pharma and the diagnostic industry typically tends to stay away from email marketing or meta marketing, but for us, this was really essential for ensuring fast patient recruitment. And this was not the first clinical trial that the day has run. We have run previous clinical trials, and patient recruitment was always the most painful point, the one that would take us a very long time and lots of really hand-holding, a very hands-on approach. So working with Lindus and taking this digital-first, data-informed consumer marketing approach to finding our patients meant, as I said at the beginning, that we were able to recruit all of the patients that we needed in, I think, some kind of a record-breaking time of less than 2 weeks. Once we had the patients, it was a single point of contact with the patient study. So they would take the tampon, they would receive the tampon at home as well as the swab, and they would have to present to a clinic for a clinician-collected swab. What we were able to demonstrate is that the tampon was the preferred device out of the self-collected swab and the clinician-collected swab. And importantly, from a public health economics perspective, we were able to demonstrate that there is significant time saving, both for the patient and the provider, from self-sampling with the tampon. The main purpose of the study was to measure diagnostic accuracy, so sensitivity and specificity. And that's data that we published, which showed that the diagnostic tampon outperformed the swab and the self-collected swab, and either outperformed or matched the sensitivity and specificity of the clinician-collected swab. So as a result of the study, we're now able to offer a wide array of screenings with the day diagnostic tampon, 14 high-risk HPV strains, vaginal microbiome screening, vaginal infection detection, sexually transmitted infections as well, really enabling the patient to catch a disease early in the context of HPV. Understanding whether you have a high-risk HPV strain is essential for preventing cervical cancer. In the context of STIs, we know that untreated STIs can lead to chronic pelvic inflammation as well as reduced fertility. We also know that 70% of chlamydia cases are asymptomatic, so it's very important to get tested regularly. And lastly, in bacterial vaginosis, so bacterial vaginosis is associated with poor fertility outcomes, including miscarriage and preterm labor. So being able to detect and treat these pathogens is really essential for advancing women's health. And the patient journey that we've created for the trial was very simple. So the patient received the kit. They then answered a few questions about their health context and the experience of using the tampon. They will then use the tampon as a regular menstrual health tampon, take it out, insert it in a plastic pouch, ship it back to the lab for analysis, and receive the results later. It's this clinical trial design that we later based our actual consumer experience on as well. So that's replicated in real world today.
I think we're all fairly aware that women's health has been historically underserved. And I think it's super interesting to see the progression of that clinical trials have a huge role to play in that issue, which also means we get to play the biggest role in the solution. And one of the biggest responsibilities we have as an organization who runs clinical research is to ensure, even if that means us asking sponsors to change designs, is to ensure that these studies are representative, particularly if they include women, and of course for women's health studies, that we're able to conduct these effectively. Yeah, it's a responsibility we take very seriously.
The one key parting thought that I have is that we've delayed solving for women's health for generation after generation. And I really don't want us to be the generation that keeps passing this challenge on to the next one. I think that the time is now. It's within our lifetime that we have to improve the standard of care for female populations. We can't afford not to do. Our economies and our societies need women to be able to fully take part, to fully live up to their human potential. And we simply can't do that if we're constantly held back by untreated vaginal infections, by chronic period and pelvic pain, by untreated menopause symptoms, particularly in the context of cervical cancer, which obviously is very close to my heart with the work that we do a day. It's an entirely preventable disease through a combination of regular screening and vaccination. And within our lifetime, we can eradicate cervical cancer. Scotland is very close to eradicating cervical cancer. So this isn't a pipe dream. It's a very real opportunity if we put our minds together and really focus on these underserved women's health conditions.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, I think we have some questions pouring in from the audience, which is great. So we'll get to some of these now. So yeah, I can go ahead and take the first four. So the question is, how can investors support more equitable clinical trials? I used to be an investor in life sciences, and frankly, the level of diligence that was done around a question like how representative is this population is poor, frankly, at the investor level. So I think investors need to recognize that there are direct financial consequences to not ensuring that your trial population is representative. And we've seen this with sponsors we work with, where I'm thinking of some phase 4 health economic studies, where the one example that comes to mind was in DIGA, which is a German reimbursement program for digital health. We had a sponsor, there was a study where the study went very well, positive readout, but because the population recruited was 70-odd% male, the product just didn't get clearance for a female population. Like half of your market gone, and obviously just a terrible shame. There are real financial as well as frankly moral consequences to not paying attention to this as investors, and I think investors are starting to understand that. But it's really by scrutinizing, having an understanding of trial designs and being able to helpfully scrutinize their investee companies on this. Yeah. And I think the next question is super interesting about sites. So yeah, obviously we represent respectively the sort of CRO and sponsor view. The view we take with sites is that we try and have a more integrated model of working with sites. And actually, this study was decentralized, the STAMP study, which kind of avoids the problem here. But when we work with sites, we try and take the burden off them. And one thing that sites, frankly, as your question highlights, Brandy, aren't necessarily good at is patient reach out. And to Valentina, your point, the importance of branding, the importance of that patient journey. This is why we feel central recruitment is really important and should basically always be deployed as an option, where you are essentially finding patients in the community via EHR screens, via social media. We have coordinators who are doing screening calls with those patients, who are checking EHRs and then referring them into a site once they've been pre-screened for eligibility. And that way everyone wins, because the site's mainly compensated based on how many patients are undergoing treatment in the study schedule, but we can stay in control of recruitment timelines. And that we find is like the best way model for addressing this issue. So the next question, just going through in order, was pricing work for recruitment efforts. Yeah, so I can speak for us, as Lindus. So we do everything internally on patient recruitment. So we have our own like social media team who are designing the adverts. When we worked with you, Valentina, we obviously co-designed them, but we design the adverts when it comes to social media, run those campaigns. We have a whole patient recruitment team. We have coordinators, as I say, who are doing those screening calls centrally. And we also have the team that manages the sort of network of referral sites, if you like, who are doing those EHR screens. So it's all done internally. And I think a big lesson that we've learned and we've seen play out again and again is that like finding the patients is actually the easy part. The hard part is like syncing up that journey and making sure that from the patient's perspective, they just have an incredibly smooth, efficient journey from identification to enrollment in a trial. And this is frankly why I think a lot of third-party vendors on patient recruitment fall short, because if all they're doing is the finding the patient part, but they're not linked up with sites, they don't have a good understanding of site capacity, they aren't working with sites to ensure they have the capacity, that just journey is going to break, and you're going to end up with, at best, a lot of wasted effort, at worst, no meaningful difference to patient recruitment efforts.
And with us, any kind of increased costs, for example, childcare costs being compensated, they're really offset by the speed of the patient recruitment, particularly in our experience in working with Lindus.
Yeah, that's a good point. And actually, I think it speaks to a question. Maybe there's sort of two questions that relate to this. So then has a question about generate any data on compensation. Off the top of my head, we have anecdotal data that essentially the recruitment rate skyrockets as soon as you file that IRB amendment to get childcare cover compensated. We've seen that in several trials in a postpartum population. I would love to do some kind of proper structured analysis on that to be able to just put the issue to bed once and for all. But yeah, Valentina, absolutely agree that if you're talking about a extra $300, $400 stipend for childcare per participant, and you're running a clinical trial where the costs are 10, 30, 50, 100K per participant, there's just no contest, right? It's an absolute drop in the ocean. And actually, this goes to another question. Where did it go? Oh, yeah. I think there was sorry, I'm just looking for it. There was a question about these additional costs for some of these sort of measures around patient centricity. And I would just say completely agree that, yeah, in that example, we had I can't remember off the top of my head the exact rate, but adding that kind of patient stipend for childcare in just caused a huge step change in recruitment speed. And for a trial where every day of delay costs potentially in the tens or hundreds of thousands, it's a extremely worthwhile investment. But yeah, I would love to do a kind of more rigorous analysis of just to quantify the ROI.
We know that the current infrastructures we have in place are not good enough to encourage women to take part in clinical investigations. And we know from female patients that one of the key barriers that they face to taking part in clinical investigations is lack of time, lack of childcare. So if we can facilitate remote clinical trials where the patient can do the monitoring at home, or if we can help reduce some of the barriers to entry, such as childcare compensation, that's really meaningful and essential, given that we know women do the majority of household labor. We know that we do the majority of childcare. This is the reality of the world today, and we need to factor this reality into the design of our clinical trials.
And then I think Brandy had another question about disease states that require recruitment directly from a site's practice. But yeah, like this sort of central recruitment model, it's not going to work for every sort of trial. And I think the most important thing is still collaborating with the site. But the problem that we see again and again is the CRO kind of just gives the responsibility of patient recruitment entirely to a site. But sites are incredibly good at many things. One of the things they're often not so good at is trying to make a trial appealing in sort of simple language to patients. And so even when maybe it's an acute population or an extremely rare population, there's always scope to collaborate with the site to work on things like leaflets, patient-facing materials, language about how a physician should position a trial to a participant that's maybe in for an insight visit already. There's still tons of things you can do. The other thing you can do is just still making sure that patient journey is as smooth as possible. So ensuring that physicians have the tools they need to send the patient information sheet, to initiate consent, all of those kind of topics. So like really thinking about that patient journey and making sure it's very smooth.
There's a question on how does pricing work for your recruitment efforts? Do you do everything internally or use outside vendors?
Yeah, we just price it internally. And I think with Stamp, this is a part and parcel of like the whole kind of end-to-end offering, where with Stamp, we presented you with kind of one fixed price for the entire clinical trial, which included patient recruitment. And the way we do pricing is it's based on outcomes, not inputs. And we will just do whatever it takes for one fixed cost to recruit as many patients as we need. And so we're not charging per ad or per patient screened. And I think that's helpful because it makes sure our incentives are aligned. Because from speaking to other CROs and sponsors, a common complaint is that if you have a kind of third-party recruitment vendor, they're just charging you by activity and they have no real incentive to make sure that they're reaching the right patients. So yeah, just making sure those incentives are aligned is key.
There's an interesting question by Andreas. Rigidity when approaching institutions mainly male dominant is a fact. Can you share with us how this affected day and if this was really used as an opportunity by you or if it was doubling the work to be done? We had a very male-heavy ethics committee, and I think they genuinely really struggled to understand why any improvements to the current standard of care were necessary. And this is something that we as female innovators in the women's health space see all the time, whether it's from investors, public funders, potential business partners, or ethics committees. Not having had the lived experience of going through a speculum pelvic exam, the ethics committee couldn't necessarily relate to what was wrong with the current process or what the improvements that the tampon would facilitate would be. So there was quite a bit of back and forth with the ethics committee.
Yeah, I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, because I may be getting confused with a different trial, but I think there was one member who, from his online presence, has a very kind of, let's say, clear interest in abstinence as a method of contraception, and so objected to the grounds of the trial on principle, which beggars belief, frankly, that I just think someone who would bring that viewpoint and see what they just shouldn't be on ethics committee. But yeah, sometimes it's that this was a UK ethics committee and it can be the luck of the draw. Fortunately, US IRBs are a lot more professional. Yeah. I think there's some lobbying we can do to improve the standard in some European countries.
Yep. We did get that comment that the best way of preventing STIs is abstinence. Is Lindus operating in Germany?
Yes, short answer. So we have a German clinical operations team, a medical team. In Germany, a lot of our activity has been around studies to support DIGA, but we've also supported studies under MDR and registrational drug trials with sites in Germany. But yeah, it's a very important market for us. I actually think of sort of European countries, of Western European countries, at least Germany and the UK are ahead in terms of more flexible patient-centric trial designs, incorporating things like remote visit, incorporating where appropriate things like self-consent prior to a screening visit. And yeah, we're very happy to run trials in Germany.
Does your team work on clinical outcome assessments? Your site says data collection and delivery.
Yes, in short, whether it's a clinician at a site providing a clinical outcome assessment, or we've also done studies in psychiatry or with kind of psychiatric endpoints, where we have a bank of clinicians with the appropriate qualifications who can administer ClinRO ECOAs essentially. But yes, in short, it's absolutely something we deliver. There was one more question, I think unanswered, about language barriers to ensure inclusivity. I can start on this one and then Valentina, please join in as well. It comes down to looking at what the population in the real world looks like, the languages spoken by that population, and obviously you'll have a diversity of languages there. But if commonly English is not super, then you obviously need to ensure that all of the patient-facing language is provided in a language that patients understand. That's as simple as translation, but obviously you need to find the right balance between medical grade translation, but then ensuring that translation is also in an appropriately to, usually we use 8 or 10-year-old reading age of comprehension to ensure that in that language, every participant can understand. And actually, even in English, I was invited to take part in a trial recently, not one run by Lindus. And with my background, I would think that I have a pretty good understanding of a lot of the terminology used, but I could barely understand the ICF and patient information sheet. And this is just a terrible problem where I would argue in a lot of trials, there should be like legal grounds to challenge whether consent is informed because of like how complex the language used in some of these consent forms. So actually what we found, this is a great use we found for generative AI, where for a lot of the consent forms and patient information sheets, we have our own sort of Gen AI products that will output a patient information sheet, an ICF, using an accepted template. But what the Gen AI is very good at doing is in rewriting the language to ensure that it is it's at like a 10-year reading level and that patients can understand it very clearly. So obviously we would never advocate just having the Gen AI write something for a clinical trial and then submitting it to an IRB, but we find it as a very helpful kind of first draft or kind of a co-pilot for helping our teams write something that's in very clear, easily understood language. And Valentina, I'm not sure if you anything to add there from your perspective.
For us, what was important was ensuring that we overcome language barriers with video instructions and illustrated instructions as well. Again, back to the point of meeting the patient where they are, there are many different ways in which different individuals process information and learn new information. Offering a diversity of touch points and communication points to your patient populations is really essential. And when you're running a digital first or digitally informed trial, it's easier to share these different assets with your patient populations.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the video. And again, with AI tools, it's pretty easy to put together a very compelling video instruction that's very specific to the trial and then make that available in the pre-screen flow at site to patients, et cetera.
And there are now some AI tools that can generate video. So you have this visualization of a person who seems very real, but they're an AI agent who can speak to you in different languages, who can adjust their language and the words that they choose on the basis of your reading level. Yeah, that we should all be trying to utilize the novel machine learning technologies and large language models.
Okay, I think that wraps up the questions that we had. Otherwise, you can reach both of us via LinkedIn, via our respective websites. We would both love to discuss any aspects of this in more detail. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining. Really delighted to chat through this with you today. And yeah, look forward to talking further offline.